Okay, I said I would put together a second short video about the specifics of the case study, things to actually put into the essay to do with the structure, and a few tips as well on a couple of the actual essay questions. Many of you come to the briefing paper drop-in sessions earlier this week. I hope that they've been helpful. For those of you who couldn't come, some of the things that I'm going to talk about now have been issues that I raised with people when they came to see me this week. So let me just say a couple of things about the structure. Most of this stuff, to start with, is things that I covered in the lecture a couple of weeks ago about structure. Each of the essays should begin with, obviously, with an introduction, and the introduction should do four things. It should obviously very quickly explain the question. Some people still have this idea that the 5 topics I've listed in the course guide that's all you need. They're just themes. It asks you about humanitarian intervention. It asks you about crisis or something like that. Basically, you need to then frame a question, a much more specific question. You know, which humanitarian intervention are you talking about, for example, which economic crisis, and then a question about that crisis, for example. So in the introduction, you need to explain your question. Secondly, set out just very quickly what the academic debates are. I'll come back to that in a second. Number 3, then you need to, in a sentence or two, explain your own argument for the essay. And then number 4, you also need to say what the structure, the plan roughly for the essay is going to be. So that's 4 things in the introduction. The question, the academic debates, the argument, your own argument, and then the structure. That's 4 things in the introduction. Then the next part of the essay should, and I said in the lecture, just very, very briefly set out what those debates are. And the idea there, and it'll probably be 250, 300 words maximum. It's just a short section at the beginning. Some people call it a literature review, but it has a very clear purpose. It basically, in response to your question, your specific question, it tells us what these other authors have already said about this particular thing. Here's what they have argued about it. And then secondly, as part of that, you should then be able to say, you know, my case study maybe challenges their views in certain ways. Here's what some people have said about neoliberalism. My case is going to demonstrate the opposite, for example. So hopefully that sort of makes some sense. Set out what other people have said about this topic, and then does your case seem to support what they've argued, or does it challenge it in some way? So that should be the next section of the paper. And then obviously after that you've got the structure, the body of the essay itself. That might be 1,000, 1,200 words. Again, make sure that in that section you structure it clearly, perhaps use subheadings. I would have thought that would be 2 or 3 subsections, perhaps 300-400 words each. And then when you get to the conclusion, again, as I said in the lecture, you can have a summary in there, but also try and relate it back to the big so what questions. What is this case actually, what does it mean? Well, why is this important? That might relate to the big debates about neoliberalism or whatever, and say, look, I've just shown, as I suggested at the beginning, that this challenges some views of neoliberalism. It might take a step beyond that and say, well, and this is why that's important. It's not just that some people have got their idea of globalization or neoliberalism or intervention wrong or something. It's that this is actually really important for the real world. It matters for the following reasons. So that might be part of your conclusion. Okay, so that's to do with the rough outline of the structure, and I've talked with a few people about that this week, as I said. Let me just go through very quickly the 5 topics then. So the first topic is about neoliberalism and winners and losers. And at some level, you don't have to cover all of the points I'm going to suggest over the next minute or two. But at some level, you need to engage neoliberalism. The kind of the big classical argument to do with neoliberalism is that if you promote market-based reforms of some kind, it's that kind of the rising tide lifts all the boats in the harbour or something like that. In a sense, everyone benefits in the long run, broadly speaking, from market-led or market-based reforms, even if there might be short-term adjustment costs. At some level, you need to engage with that. The idea that there are winners and losers is controversial from a kind of a quote-unquote neoliberal perspective. There might well be losers, so the neoliberal argument would go, but there would be short-term losers. In the end, everyone would tend to benefit. So at some level, you need to engage with that. Do you agree with that neoliberal argument or not? Competition, for example, greater competition promotes lower prices. That would suggest that people win. Have you got a case study that seems to support that or perhaps challenge that in some ways? I know some people have come to me this week and they've been talking about groups in particular countries that have resisted competition for various reasons, whether that's farmers in Australia or something like that, and they've got a good case study of people who have resisted pressures for competition and sort of regulatory downgrading of some kind in environmental standards or something like that. So you might consider resistance against neoliberalism as a kind of case study. But at some level, it needs to engage with that sort of big neoliberal argument. So that's the first case study. The second one's about globalization and the retreat of the state. In political science, in IR, in IPE, as I'm sure you're aware, the typical globalization argument says that the more you liberalize, the stronger the market pressures and forces get, and the weaker the state gets. That's a sort of a typical sort of globalization argument. And so in a sense, you're using hopefully some specific, and I would say as well, recent examples. I mean, this goes for a lot of the case studies. A few people have come to me and they've said, I want to look at, I don't know, the 1920s, 1930s, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I think given that you're being asked to have, maybe 7 to 15 independent sources, it's unlikely you're going to be able to find something new and original to say or to as a source from, say, the 1930s or even possibly the 1980s. I would suggest with the globalization one then, you're looking for some kind of perhaps recent example that supports or challenges the globalization thesis. You might also consider in that question, is the framing of this right? Is it? You might have an example that says, look, I don't think the state has got weaker in the face of globalization. Okay, that's fine. That's a good start, and you can show some kind of way that the state has adapted. But perhaps you might want to consider the question, well, what is the state? How are we to think of it? Is it a sensible way for political science or IR to think about the state coming and going, the state in retreat, and the return of the state, as some people started talking about with the global financial crisis? So that's question number 2. Question number 3, compare and contrast one or more crises and what are the big lessons from them. I mean, that goes back to what I just said. I think it's quite challenging to do that if you want to say, I want to look at the recent financial crisis and say the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression of the 1929 and 1930s. There's nothing wrong with drawing parallels, obviously, between historical crises, but I would say, and I've said this to people this week, it would be much better to focus the majority of your case study on a more contemporary example. The Latin American debt crisis, Latin American debt crisis is obviously slightly more contemporary. The Asian financial crisis is obviously even more contemporary. There's obviously things going on over the 2000s as well, even before we get to the global financial crisis. So there's lots of more contemporary examples. I think it would just be a lot easier to find a kind of set of new or contemporary material if you looked at something a little bit more contemporary as well. You might also want to think, if you want to look at an older case study, the Latin American debt crisis, for example, the way to perhaps make that slightly more contemporary might be to say, okay, we know perhaps the causes of the crisis, but what happens after the crisis? What happens to Latin America after the Latin American debt crisis? What happens in Asia after the Asian financial crisis, or any one of these other perhaps smaller crises? Don't feel limited with that one to thinking of one of these kind of big events, big crises that everyone writes about. If you can find an original idea, a smaller, less well-known crisis, for example, that might be a very good example. And I think that point also goes then for the humanitarian intervention question. Again, what I've said to people on that one is that the way that IR tends to think about humanitarian intervention often involves questions of morality, ethics, sovereignty, responsibility to protect, all this kind of stuff, which is all well and good. I don't have a problem with that particularly. But what I'm trying to suggest to you in this one is that intervention comes in all sorts of different forms. You might want to consider aid, for example, as an alternative to simply military conflict, military intervention. And again, I think, as I said with the crisis question, that perhaps broadens the scope a little bit. Perhaps there's ways of doing that without just focusing on the usual, Rwanda or something like that, Kosovo, the usual suspects. Perhaps there's another way of thinking about that. A way to think about the kind of the quote unquote economic costs as well is to think about, what happens to the economy, to the people, to the social conditions, etc., perhaps after these interventions as well. Not just the reasons for, the motivations for, whether it was right to intervene, but what happens to these countries after the interventions. How much of what happens in these countries is down to the nature of the intervention, how much of it was there before as a problem within some of these economies, etc. These are ways of thinking about the intervention question. And the final one then, which it's probably the one that's closest to my heart, but I don't think that many of you are planning on doing it, to do with practices in banking and finance. That's fine. I'm not offended by that. That's okay. But in a sense, I would suggest there's probably two things to think about for that one. One is perhaps you're looking at a very narrow reform that's taken place after the financial crisis. There might be an example of a bigger trend. I mean, you might link that, for example, to the question of globalization. If you're doing the globalization question, the retreat of the state, the financial crisis question at the end, the banking and finance question, actually seems to fit quite well with that, because after the financial crisis, a lot of people were talking about the return of the state getting stronger and tougher on international finance. You might want to think about that, perhaps by looking at a particular reform. I don't know, the Dodd-Frank Act, for example, in America is an obvious example. The Vickers Commission reforms in Britain, for example. So some political reform as an example of a bigger trend. Or I would have thought the other way of doing it, and you may be able to think of third or fourth examples, but the other example that springs to my mind is looking at what has gone on in the banks themselves. How have the banks responded? It's one thing to talk about, the regulators are trying to do this particular thing, but what about the banks? How have the banks responded to the banking crisis? How much responsibility have they taken? How much have they changed their banking practices? And my sense is there's been a lot of change in the banks, and you might want to use that as an example of some of the things that you want to talk about in that essay. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. This is more, as I said, about the structure of the essay itself and things to consider. Don't feel limited. It's not an exhaustive list that I've just given you. They're just things that have come up from the conversations I've had with people this week. And as I said, if you want to talk more about any of those things, then feel free to come to one of my office hours over the next few weeks.